Associate Assistant Deputy Minister, Cultural Affairs. We have Katie O'Meara, Policy Analyst. And we have Galen Teschner-Weaver, Policy Analyst. So I missed the hyphen in there first. So now, Mr. Dufresne, thank you for waiting, and you've been very patient. And I now invite you to make an opening statement of 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Mesdames.
Thank you, Chair. Members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to appear on your study of Bill S-210, an act to restrict young persons' online access to sexually explicit material. As Privacy Commissioner, my mandate is to protect and promote individuals' fundamental right to privacy. This includes providing advice, guidance, and recommendations for protecting personal information and overseeing compliance with Canada's two federal privacy laws, the Privacy Act, which applies to federal government institutions, and the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, or PIPEDA, which is Canada's federal private sector privacy law. In January, I launched my strategic plan for my office, which is focused on 3 priority areas: maximizing the OPC's impact on promoting and protecting the fundamental rights to privacy, addressing and advocating for privacy in times of technological change, and championing the privacy rights of children.
Purposes of Bill S-210, which include protecting the mental health of young people from the harmful effects of being exposed to sexually explicit material. The bill does raise some privacy implications, and I would propose some changes to address them. As drafted, the bill provides that any organization that makes sexually explicit material available online to a young person for commercial purposes is guilty of an offense and liable to a fine that would increase in amounts depending on whether it was a first or subsequent offense. A defense is available if an organization believes that the young person was at least 18 years of age, having implemented a prescribed age verification method to limit access to the sexually explicit material. Age verification can raise privacy implications as it generally requires the collection of personal information, which could include biometrics or identity documentation. As drafted, the bill would apply to services such as social media and search engines that may make available some sexually explicit material, but that may be primarily focused on other content. This could result in age verification requirements that, including when the majority of content may not be of a sexually explicit nature. To address this, the committee could consider restricting the requirement for age verification to websites that primarily provide sexually explicit material for commercial purposes. Avant de prescrire un mécanisme de vérification de l'âge, le gouvernement...
Before presiding the age verification method, the Governor and Council will need to consider certain criteria, including whether the method maintains user privacy and protects users' personal information. I would recommend these criteria are important. I will recommend adding additional criteria to the list to ensure that the prescribed methods are sufficiently privacy protective. Specifically, this could include assessing whether the prescribed methods are proportionate and limit the collection of personal information to what is strictly necessary for the verification. Age verification methods should also prevent tracking or profiling of individuals across visits to websites or services.
Jurisdictions have taken action to prevent children from accessing pornography, but some of these laws have a narrower application than Bill S-210. For example, Texas and Utah only require age verification measures on sites that meet a certain threshold of pornographic content. Some regulators have also worked to mitigate the privacy risk associated with the use of age verification technologies. For example, Spanish and French regulators have worked with researchers to develop and evaluate potential age verification mechanisms. Le commissariat poursuit ses recherches dans ce domaine.
My office is conducting further research in this area and is a member of an international working group with other privacy regulators to share information on age verification methods and learn from each other's experiences. Notably, members of this working group intend to publish a joint statement of principles for age assurance later this year. My office is also developing guidance for organizations on age assurance and privacy and will launch an exploratory consultation on this next month.
10 be adopted. I will be happy to provide advice on regulations that pertain to privacy and the protection of personal information at the appropriate time. I will be pleased to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dufresne. We'll go now to Mr. Ripley. I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting me to appear before you to discuss Bill S210. As Associate Assistant Deputy Minister for Cultural Affairs at the Department of Canadian Heritage, I am responsible for the proposed Online Harms Act contained in Bill C-63. During elaboration of C-63, the department heard directly from experts, survivors, civil society, and members of the public on what should be done to combat the proliferation of harmful content online. A common theme emerged from these consultations: the vulnerability of children online and the need to take proactive measures to protect them. It is with this in mind that the Online Harm Bill proposes a duty to protect children, which will require platforms to incorporate age-appropriate design features. Furthermore, Bill C-63 also proposes a specialized regulatory authority with the skills and expertise to develop regulations, guidelines, and codes of practice in consultation with experts and civil society.
10 seeks to achieve a similarly admirable goal of protecting children online. However, the bill is highly problematic for a number of reasons, including a scope that is much too broad, both in terms of regulated services as well as regulated content, possible risk to Canadians' privacy, especially considering the current state of age verification frameworks internationally, structural incoherence that seems to mix criminal elements with regulatory elements, a troubling dependence on website blocking as the primary enforcement mechanism, and finally, a lack of clarity around implementation and an unrealistic implementation timeline. I'll briefly unpack a few of these concerns in greater detail. As drafted, Bill S210 would capture a broad range of websites and services that make sexually explicit material available on the Internet for a commercial purpose, including search engines, social media platforms, streaming and video on-demand applications, and Internet service providers. Moreover, the bill's definition of sexually explicit material is not limited to pornography, but instead extends to a broader range of mainstream entertainment content with nudity or sex scenes, including content that would be found on services like Netflix, Disney Plus, or CBC Gem. Mandating age verification requirements for this scope of services and content would have far-reaching implications for how Canadians access and use the Internet. While efforts are underway globally in other jurisdictions to develop and prescribe age verification technologies, there is still a lack of consensus that they are sufficiently accurate and sufficiently privacy-respecting. For example, France and Australia remain concerned that the technology is not yet sufficiently mature, and testing of various approaches is ongoing. Over the next couple of years, the UK will ultimately require age assurance for certain types of services under its Online Safety Act, and Ofcom is currently consulting on the principles that should guide the rollout of these technologies. But the requirement is not yet in force, and services do not yet have to deploy age assurance at scale. And in jurisdictions that have already moved ahead, such as certain U.S. states or Germany, there continues to be questions about privacy, effectiveness, and overall compliance. In short, these international examples show that mandates regarding age verification or age assurance are still a work in progress. There is also no other jurisdiction proposing a framework comparable in scope to Bill S210. Website blocking remains a highly contentious enforcement instrument that poses a range of challenges and could impact Canadians' freedom of speech and Canada's commitment to an open and free Internet and net neutrality. Je tiens à refermer une fois de
I would like to reiterate once again that the government remains committed to better protecting children online. However, in the government's view, the answer is not to prescribe a specific technology that creates a danger for privacy and breaches our commitment towards an open Internet. It is essential that all measures developed to achieve this objective create a framework that is both flexible and informed about what needs to be done to protect children online. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to take your questions.
Thank you for your remarks. We'll go now to our questions. We'll start with Mr. Caputo with 6 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here on this important matter. I think that it goes without saying that everybody around this table believes that protecting children from materials that they shouldn't be consuming is of great importance, particularly sexually explicit materials. I have a 10-year-old son, and it's unfortunately time to have the talk because we heard in the Senator's prior testimony about 10% of 9-year-olds, I believe, was the statistic. I had to step out, but I was going to verify that was the statistic. So clearly there is a pressing and substantial public interest in restricting children from this type of material. Can I ask to the Privacy Commissioner, did you appear at the Senate committee or send any briefs or anything like that?
No, I did not.
Okay, thank you. The focus, a lot of what I'm looking at here, and the Privacy Commissioner did speak about regulation. Could any of the concerns you mentioned be allayed through appropriate regulation, sir?
I mentioned one aspect with respect to the scope of the organization captured, so that may be something that would require change to the statute. But yes, the regulations, we recommend necessity and proportionality. We recommend no tracking of individuals with this information. These are consistent with international best practices and agreements between my colleagues. They could be put in regulation. If the statute adds the criterion, then it's just more certainty that the government will follow through on that. But either way, I will certainly be making recommendations to the government at the recommendation stage with respect to those contents.
So just for example, on the tracking of individuals, and I'm looking at the regulation section, which is sub 2 that I'm focused on. You're probably well aware of that section. I'll let you find section 11 sub 2 here. Sorry, if you could turn to section 11, yes. Sub 2, please. So when we're looking at the tracking of individuals, which is something that as Privacy Commissioner is probably chief or salient among your concerns, when I look at sub C and sub D, talking about the collection of personal information solely for age verification purposes and except to the extent required by law, and the destruction of any such information once the verification is completed, especially when it comes to sub D, does that not address the concern with tracking? Because my reading of the legislation is that tracking wouldn't be permitted on that basis.
I want to make sure that there's as much clarity possible on those points. So certainly that would be an argument to put forward in terms of make sure the regulations preclude that. And if that's the understood interpretation by the government in adopting the regulation, then that leads to the right outcome. I'm flagging that monitoring or profiling or using this for advertising or any other different purposes is a concern. And so we should be explicit about that, either in the statute or at a minimum in the regulations themselves.
And the reason I'm asking for this is not to push back, but just to give you my reading, because when I read this, when I read sub C, for instance, collects and uses personal information solely for age verification purposes, when I read that, for instance, that to me would preclude the use of this information for marketing. I don't think you can get much clearer than the term solely, for instance. Do you see where I'm coming from there?
I understand that, and I think that when we're looking at age verification, given some of the concerns and in order to provide information to Canadians and to reassure them about what are we talking about here and Is there a clear contradiction between age verification and privacy? No, you can have both of those things, but you need to have an age verification system that is appropriate and is designed with privacy as top of mind. So again, making sure that this is not information that can lead to those outcomes.
Certainly. Where I'm going with this is that when I read Section 11, Sub 2, it's my view that an appropriate balance can be struck based on the instructions that the section gives us in terms of how the regulations should operate. In other words, data is only to be used for age verification, and it's not to be used for any other reason, and it is to be destroyed once that's once the goal, as in age verification, has been accomplished. To me, that seems like it's going fairly far in addressing any privacy concerns, because the whole point here is to preclude children from accessing harmful information, and we're saying you have to record only for this purpose, you can't use it for any other purpose, and you must destroy. I'm just trying to see how we could actually go any further in regulation than that.
Well, other data protection authorities have set this out, for instance, my Spanish colleagues, as explicitly as a principle, saying this should not be used for tracking, this should not be used for profiling. So I think being absolutely clear on that, as I say, whether in the bill or in the regulation themselves, I think is important. Technology can evolve, tracking technologies can evolve. This has to be technology neutral. We need to make sure that the principle will capture whatever advances in technology and that it is used to verify age and for nothing else.
Thank you. The fact that it could be used in regulation, I think, satisfies where I was going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Caputo. We go now to Mr. Biddle. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here. And I agree with Mr. Caputo in that I think around the table we'd all like to see the same thing in terms of children not having access to it. But I'd like to start with Mr. Dufresne. You mentioned in your comments about changes required perhaps to narrow the focus of the legislation. And I had mentioned in previous questioning that I'm a huge Game of Thrones fan. I won't ask you if you've seen it. I don't want to put you on the hot seat, but if that is a question to put one on the hot seat. But would shows like that put a company like Crave, which is, I believe, owned by Bell, potentially under the scope of this legislation if we don't bring in amendments like you suggest?
Well, again, this would be up to the courts and the organization that would look into that. But I think that you look at the definition, sexually explicit material in the criminal code, it is describing photographic, film, or visual representation. A person engaged in explicit sexual activity could be written material whose dominant characteristic is the description for sexual purpose of explicit sexual activity. So it raises that question of what will be captured, and so bringing that clarity. I understand that the purpose of this is to capture pornographic websites and other types of visual images and so on, and protect children from that. So that's one of the points that I'm highlighting.
Yeah, I guess I'll ask the same question to Mr. Ripley, because when I originally saw this bill, I just started thinking of movies that I had seen. I listed a few, like Schindler's List or Green Book or Crash, Gladiator, movies that I think we all know or can all agree are artistic, and I believe all have won Academy Award for Best Picture, though we may disagree that some of those films should have won in that year. But Mr. Ripley, would this bill capture those films in if they were put on a website?
The government's position is yes, they would be captured, because the definition of sexually explicit material that is being proposed would include things like the depiction of sex scenes or nudity, where again it's nudity for a sexual purpose. So those services would be required to institute age verification to access that kind of content. I think what needs to be understood is the definition that's being proposed makes sense in the context of the criminal code, where it's speaking to a variety of offenses, including when adults may be engaging with minors using sexually explicit content, and so it makes sense in that context. But it is not limited strictly to pornography. It is broader than pornography and would capture, again, things like sex scenes or nudity.
To Mr. Ripley, I know we've talked about the CRTC a lot in your when I was on a different committee, and you were a witness there. But it would seem to be, and perhaps you can correct me, the most likely organization to be policing this legislation would be the CRTC. I was wondering if you could explain that, or if there are any other organizations that you're aware of that would be involved in that.
Thank you for the question. So the government is concerned about the implementation proposed by the bill. To be clear, the way that this would play out is there would be a minister designated, and then that minister would need to make a proposal to the Governor and Council or to Cabinet about which federal department or agency is best placed to administer this piece of legislation. And so if it was adopted as is, indeed, a minister would have to canvass the existing agencies or departments and make an assessment about which is best able. And I would highlight that in the context of the Online Harms Act, the government ultimately came to the conclusion that there is not an existing entity, whether it be the CRTC or, with all respect to the person sitting next to me, the Privacy Commissioner, who is well equipped to play that role. The government is of the opinion that we need an entity that has the right expertise and the right framework in order to regulate, the online space as it relates to online harms, and that is why the government is proposing the creation of a new entity to make sure that the oversight of this space is done appropriately with the right safeguards in place.
I guess back quickly to Mr. Dufresne, because it was mentioned, do you think your office would be in a position to police this legislation?
This particular legislation, as I say, we would take on the mandate that Parliament will give us and fulfill it to the best of our abilities. But I don't think that the intention would be that this is something that my office would deal with. With the caveat that in terms of regulation making, we are happy to provide advice and input and be consulted on that to ensure that this is done with a privacy lens.
Thank you so much. I don't have much time, but if I could turn to Mr. Ripley, if he could expand on Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, with respect to what the government is intending to do with respect to protecting individuals from harms that are on the internet.
Thank you for the question. So the Online Harms Act would apply to social media services, and it proposes 3 core duties, one of which was alluded to earlier, is the duty to protect children. That is fashioned as quite a flexible duty, which would permit the Digital Safety Commission to put in place a number of different kinds of measures or obligations to better protect Canadian children in the online space through the use of age-appropriate design. And so the government's view is that is a sufficiently flexible duty that could accommodate a question about whether there are certain services, for example, that should use age assurance or age verification mechanisms. But the government's view is that framework has the appropriate safeguards in place, and there would actually be a regulator with that mandate and the necessary expertise through consultation with civil society and experts to do that in an accurate way and in a privacy-respecting way if it was to be considered.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. On y va maintenant, Madame Michaud. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
On to Ms. Michaud for 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being with us today. We appreciate it tremendously. This is a very interesting conversation we've been having, and I understood that the government was reluctant to support it, and I didn't know why. Now it's becoming clearer to me. I understand that the definition of sexually explicit material for you is too broad. I'm looking for a solution here. I'm looking for a solution to make it more acceptable for you. Should the bill have mentioned pornography directly, explicitly, and defined it in the bill directly instead of using the term sexually explicit material? Would that have changed any minds for you? Would it have made it more acceptable? Maybe not acceptable per se, but wouldn't it lower the chance that a nudity scene in a movie be included in this bill and targeted by it? Thank you for the question. I cannot take any position on potential amendments to the bill, but what I will say, and if I understood properly the intentions of the senator, I believe that her intention is to target pornography specifically. As you mentioned, the definition of pornography is broader, or rather the definition of sexually explicit material is broader than that of pornography. So if it is the intention of the senator and members around the table is to truly target pornography, we could talk about how that definition could be amended to make it less broad, because at the moment it is quite broad indeed. That was a first question I had. You also have concerns with regard to privacy and people's data. Can you elaborate on those concerns with regard to privacy? In addition, I know that we also make comparisons with Bill C-63, but these two are quite different to me. Yes, we want to protect children from online harmful content with Bill 63. It's perfectly laudable objective. There's also seems to be an objective of limiting access to sexually explicit materials and pornography. You want to create a body with C-63, and that looks like the Online Digital Safety Commission would be quite effective at fighting that, and other commissions in other countries play a similar role for age verification. Can you talk about your other concerns you may have? Yes, thank you for these questions. When it comes to Bill C-63, in a context where the objective of the legislation is to promote online safety and to fight back against harmful content, and rather to protect them against harmful content, there is a duty to protect children created under Section 64, and it's quite supple, flexible to date. It says that there is a duty to protect children in compliance with Section 5. In addition, Section 65 gives the Commission some powers to follow a series of duties and obligations that must be integrated in the implementation of the Commission's duties. The government has the flexibility to look at social media and define ways to better protect children. During these hearings, we can certainly think about the appropriateness of adopting age verification writ large. But once again, we're doing this today in the context of having a regulator with specific needed expertise. In addition, there are mechanisms that have been developed to consult with civil society and to consult with experts to ensure that these solutions are well-founded. Thank you. I imagine that you've been looking at what's going on in other countries, including the countries that were mentioned earlier. We mentioned Germany, the UK, France. Senator Miville Deschênes' proposal to use a third party and not do business with pornography sites to do age verification, she suggested that. Do you believe this is in the appropriate way to move forward on this? Yes, we are looking at any new developments on the international scale. The government does not disagree that there is a lot of developments happening, but we say that we do not have enough experience with this when compared to our international partners such as Australia and France. Australia and France have been studying this, and they are testing various solutions as we speak. They haven't completed their work up to date. We've seen that in the United States, for example, as you've said, there is a need to have the digital infrastructure in place and the legal infrastructure to do so. In Louisiana, for example, there are state verifications that have been incorporated to permit that access. Other states have moved legislation. And some sites have shut down in those states because the infrastructure does not exist yet. There are, in essence, many solutions. For example, tokens that can be used to verify age. And there are also face scanning solutions, facial recognition. What's important is that these solutions are implemented in a context where there are safeguards to ensure that people's privacy is not compromised. We do not want to create a framework that sets out an obligation or a duty without knowing full well that the safeguards are in place. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Michaud.
We'll go now to Mr. McGregor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Dufresne, I'd like to start with you. I just need some clarification. So your opening remarks, you had recommended that the committee consider restricting the requirement for age verification to websites that primarily provide sexually explicit material for commercial purposes. So, where exactly would you like to see us do that? I mean, I know in the interpretation section of this bill, it has a definition for organization, same meaning as Section 2 of the Criminal Code. Is that where you'd like to see a little bit more specificity, or can you identify?
Sure. Well, it could be in the definition. It could be in the offense, talking about makes available or primarily makes available. We've pointed to international comparators in Texas and Utah where they talk about substantially, or talk about sometimes even a third. They reference a third of the material. So just a quantitative requirement could be a way of targeting those broader websites, pornographic websites.
Okay, thank you. And I also want to turn, I know you had an exchange with Mr. Caputo on Section 11. I know you had recommended some additional criteria. My question is really on 11.2, the wording before we get to the list, because I asked this to the senator. It just says, before prescribing an age verification method under subsection 1, the governor in general must consider whether the method. Are you satisfied with language that says must consider, or would you prefer language that forces the governor and council to actually follow these? Like, for me personally, I look at that gives the government a little bit of a way out, like, oh, we addressed 3 out of 5, we did consider everything. But if the governor and council was forced to verify that it is reliable, that it maintains privacy, that it collects and uses personal information solely for age verification purposes. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I think you asked a good question. I think the senator gave a good answer to your question in terms of this is in the bill. There's an expectation that the governor and council will consider this. It's explicit. Would I prefer stronger language? The mechanism must include the following things, or I think that's stronger language, and I would be supportive of that. But I think that the requirement of must consider, I also tend to presume good faith on the government that they're going to draft regulations. This statute says this. If it's completely absent, then it's an obvious element to raise. And I would certainly, as I say, expect to be consulted on the development of regulations of that nature, and I would be making recommendations to make sure they're privacy protective.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Ripley, I'd like to turn to you. I know that you did express hesitation on forming an opinion on possible amendments that this committee might consider. But that being said, like, we also as committee members need to know that if we are going to make amendments, how they're going to be perceived by the government. And I know that you were hesitant to, expand a little bit on the definition of what sexually explicit material is. But I guess I want to know from the department's point of view, how open to interpretation are you? Like, do you need us as a committee to create much more specific language? How do you, we want to know from your point of view what you need us to do. Like, help us help you.
Thank you for the question. And again, I would reiterate that I'm not in a position to take in a place to take a position on behalf of the government with respect to amendments. But what I would point you towards is that, again, the problematic aspects of the definition in the criminal code are really the subparagraph A, where you do not see, like you see in subparagraphs B and C, for example, the caveat of for sexual purpose, right? And so, again, in subparagraph A, the language is broad enough to capture sex scenes or nudity, regardless of whether they are being shown for a sexual purpose, for example. And so, again, it would capture entertainment content.
Again, if we go ahead in the bill to page 4, section 8.1, and this is where we're talking about the enforcement authority. If the enforcement authority has reasonable grounds to believe that an organization has committed an offense under section 5, so how do you interpret reasonable grounds? I mean, do we not trust people to know the difference between a movie on Netflix and what is obviously pornography? I mean, a movie, as Mr. Biddle recommended, that has very sexually explicit scenes, it's not being commercially made available for that single purpose. It's a part of a story. Whereas I think we all know that pornography, its main raison d'etre is that sexually explicit material.
So thank you. The challenge is the definition that the bill is based on. The definition of sexually explicit material is not limited to pornography. So the offense in paragraph 5 is any organization that for commercial purposes makes available sexually explicit material on the internet to a young person is guilty of an offense, right? And so the reasonable ground to believe is whether they've made sexually explicit material available. And again, there's nothing in the definition of sexually explicit material that limits it to pornography. As I mentioned, that subparagraph A of the definition of photographic, film, video, or other visual representation, whether or not was made by electronic or mechanical means, that shows a person who is engaged in or is depicted as engaged in explicit sexual activity. There's no limitation there that it's pornographic. And then the next one, the dominant characteristic of which is the depiction for a sexual purpose. You see the sexual purpose. So again, there's certain places where you see this caveat, and that first subparagraph that I read doesn't have that limitation.
I also want to refer that those two are separated by an or, not an and, which is an important part to make. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Okay, we'll start our second round now with, so this is a 5 minute, and 2.5. We will end this round. I think the consensus is after Mr. McGregor. So we will start with Mr. Jennings for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. Look, we're obviously familiar with the Liberal government's position on this bill, and with respect to the officials, of course, you're in a position to support that position. Your role as an official is not to come here and state your disagreement with government policy, even if you might privately disagree with government policy. I will just say, I think that many of the arguments you put forward were clearly refuted by the senator already, and I also want to just say that I think Bill C-63 is a real disaster. It raises actual censorship issues. It has nothing on age verification. It's far broader than S-210 at every level. It's enforced by kind of vaguely empowered bureaucratic agencies that include dealing with speech. So, I think most Canadians who have seen what your government, and to be fair, I understand your role as a nonpartisan public servant, fearless advice and faithful implementation, but what the Liberal government has put forward is not being received well, I think, across the board in terms of Bill C-63. Just on the issues with Section 171, look, I'm looking at the criminal code and trying to understand the argument here, but we have one definition of sexually explicit material in the criminal code, and implicitly, it's sort of being suggested that maybe we could have multiple different definitions of sexually explicit material operating at the same time. But it seems eminently logical that you would have one definition that relies on the existing jurisprudence. And look, if, as Mr. Biddle has suggested, if this definition covers Game of Thrones, then it's already a problem because it's already violates the criminal code if in the commission of another offense you were to show a child that material. So you already could run afoul of the criminal code if you put on Game of Thrones in your home for your 16-year-old. That's not happening. No one's getting arrested and going to jail because they let their 16-year-old watch Game of Thrones. So if that's not happening already offline, then maybe that suggests that this extensive reinterpretation of what the existing law already says is a little bit exaggerated. And look, in this context, we also know that Pornhub has been represented by a well-connected Liberal lobbyist who has met with Liberals in the lead up to the vote. I want to ask the Privacy Commissioner about what he said in terms of potential amendments. Social media, how this would apply on social media. So I'm going to just pose the question that, look, I've got young children. I obviously don't want them accessing the major well-known pornography websites. I also don't want them seeing pornographic material on any other website that they might go to for a legitimate purpose. So if my children are on social media, or I mean, they're not, but you know, if they were on another website, if they were watching a YouTube video and an ad, whatever it was, I would want to ensure that 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds were not accessing pornography, regardless of the platform and regardless of the percentage of that company's overall business model it is. So I don't really understand philosophically why it would make sense or protect anyone's privacy to have an exemption for sites where it's just a small part of what they do, because if the point is to protect children, then the point is to protect children wherever they are. I'd be curious for your response to that.
There's been discussions, if we look at the UK age-appropriate code, or we're looking at general design for sites for children. So there can be a range of tools that can be used. There could be parental approval. There could be education. There could be, and so a big part of the discussion is the risk-based approach. So the higher the risk, the higher the tool you're going to use. And so if you go to the age verification, that's a higher level tool than parental or education or outreach. So all of those things can be considered. But if the goal is to get at pornographic websites, I raised the question in terms of the numerical element. So
yeah, I mean, I would say, I'll give it back to you in a moment, but I would just say the goal is to prevent my children, other people's children, from accessing sexually explicit material on the internet. And in the same way that we don't let children access alcohol, if they're accessing alcohol in a bar or at a hotel that has many other lines of business, the point is children shouldn't be accessing alcohol. And so, given that there already are age gates on, for instance, some of these sites, the senator mentioned on well, it's not really an effect, but on Twitter there is already a kind of letting you know you're going into a particular area here. It doesn't seem like it would be difficult to apply that age verification principle everywhere where that kind of material exists.
Well, some of the principles that we put forward often are necessity and proportionality, and making sure that you're using the least amount of personal information for your goals. And so that's why I'm talking about necessity and proportionality in the regulations, not tracking, using, again, the smallest amount and asking Canadians to provide the least amount possible of personal information. That said, age verification is appropriate in appropriate context.
Well, and I hope you're significantly engaged on the regulation, obviously, because you have a lot of expertise to offer at that point. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll go now to Mr. McDonald. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. Extremely important topic, and I think we're all trying to get to the same result, and that's protect children as much as possible. I want to go back to Mr. Dufresne, and I was trying to find some information on the program that's being used in Spain. So I was wondering if do you have the name of that program that they actually use for verification?
Well, they're developing information on potential tools that would be third-party tools that would verify your age. And the goal would be that when you're verified by this tool, then you go to a website. You're not giving your age to that website. It just says, I've been verified. And so they've issued documentation. They call it the Decalogue of Principles. And they talk about what are the things we want to see in there. One of them is no tracking. One of them is risk, mitigate risk, use it for the appropriate purposes. And they have been working on potential tools. My French colleagues as well. Australia is doing a pilot project to test this out. So there's work happening, and we're going to continue this work with our colleagues internationally to develop principles and then work with industry.
So do you see anything in the effect of these two proposals that you have put forward to countries like your counterparts in Spain or the U.S. and say, is this being incorporated into the technology verification that they potentially could use?
Well, we're working very closely with them with the goal of issuing a joint statement of principles to say, here's what we want to see as a community in terms of age verification tools. Here are the principles. I'll be doing some consultation later in Canada to see here's what we propose. Here's how we get this balance. But again, making sure that you're using this to identify the age, or not the age, the specific age, but the fact that the person is a minor or an adult, that you have, you can do this anonymously, that there are some checks and balance, that there's safeguards for that information. You don't want that information to be breached and then lead to challenges. So we're looking at a full spectrum of principles, but also the technological implications.
So we heard in here today a little bit about reporting mechanisms, enforcement, maybe not clear on it, digital literacy, partnerships with tech companies. I guess just for my own verification, when we're using a third-party technical company and we're dealing with, say, Pornhub, and there is some sort of infraction, although Pornhub is not necessarily, and I'm assuming this, and Pornhub is only getting the information that says, yes, this individual is 18 years old, or no, the individual is not 18 years old. So if there's some infraction with the technical company, who's liable? Is it Pornhub who hired the technical company, or is government responsible for the technical company? Like, where's that liability lay?
Well, I think the bill as drafted would say that it's a defense for the organization, in this case Pornhub, that to have believed the person was not a minor, and that they would have done that by using the age verification mechanism prescribed by law. So if the mechanism, there is a breach, there is concern there, I think that would then get raised and would raise questions about that tool and the provider.
Pornhub would not necessarily be the responsibility or the liability. It would be the technical company.
We'd have to see the case-by-case scenario. Pornhub would have to establish that it has met its obligation under the Act, which is to verify the age with the prescribed mechanism.
So I know the senator mentioned, and I never had a question to the senator, obviously, but double anonymous method verification. Can anybody explain what that exactly is for me or for us?
So my understanding would be, again, there's a variety of systems in place to protect an individual's privacy. So again, a token-based system whereby, that entity validates that you are of 18, and then the technology when you go to access a pornographic website or something like that, there's no identifying information in that token that you use. For example, again, other technologies around facial scanning or whatnot in an environment where, again, there's no personal information that is being held. And again, that would be the objective, to make sure that infrastructure is in place. But again, what we are seeing internationally is that jurisdictions are still working through this. It's been years, and there's not consensus yet on the accuracy and privacy ensuring nature of these. And in this context, we have a 1-year implementation timeline where the minister would have to choose an entity. That entity would then have to do the appropriate consultations and put in place the framework. Otherwise, every service that is in violation of this bill is theoretically subject to committing an offense, and therefore subject to potential website blocking.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Thank you. Okay, we go. On y va maintenant, Madame Michaud.
Proceeding with Ms. Michaud for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to get back to the definition of sexually explicit material, and I think that my colleague, Mr. Jennis, had a good point. He said that, well, there could be a nudity scene in a film or movie or a show, and that could be considered as sexually explicit material if Bill S210 is adopted. Therefore, we could have questions that could arise about current sexually explicit materials that are available. If there is a scene in a movie that is recognized as sexually explicit, from this point, it's almost as if it would have already be considered as such. So I'm not really sure where your concerns arise. Anyone can answer this question. Thank you. It's a good question. If you look in the criminal code, there is a definition, but there's also a reference to other violations under the criminal code. So showing sexually explicit material to, in certain particular contexts, could be an offense. You can see there are references to other criminal code violations. That's the answer to your question. It's not the same. It's apples and oranges. As I said earlier, the government is also concerned that there is a conflation of criminal law and regulations. If the purpose is to create a regulatory framework, then there needs to be a clear, positive objective to limit pornography to children, and then there can be a framework developed with the appropriate sanctions. But now, the way it's written, it's unclear. It's unclear if Parliament wishes to. It's unclear whether Parliament wishes to create a criminal code violation or a regulatory framework. What clarification is needed, in your opinion? According to the government, if the intention of Parliament was to create a regulatory framework, there would need to be a positive requirement, positive duty. Then tools can arise that are used in a regulatory context, such as monetary penalties, administrative penalties, etc. And then there could be an appropriate development of a regulatory framework. But what has been proposed here is a violation, and yes, it's defensible from with certain arguments, but if you don't have a defense, the agency that is responsible for enforcing the act can obtain an order to access said information. If the bill reflects this, well, there could be a situation where certain services could be blocked, and these services would have a lot of these contents. Yes, they would have pornography, but other content as well. And is blocking those sites an appropriate and proportional response? This would go against a right to information and right for all Canadians to access content online. I'm sorry. the blocking agreement does not seem to be a proportional response to the framework that is being proposed. Thank you, Ms. Michaud.
Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The testimony today has been interesting. I think it's led the committee down a few different paths as we consider Bill S-210. I guess what I wanted to know from you, Mr. Ripley, I think we've heard a lot about like the potential pitfalls with the term sexually explicit material as referenced in the criminal code, and the how it could be overly broad. But I'm wondering though, if we go down further in the bill to like still on page 3, section 6.2, where it says that no organization shall be convicted of an offense under section 5 if the act is alleged to constitute if the act alleged to constitute the offense has a legitimate purpose related to science, medicine, education, or the arts. So that legitimate purpose phrase there,